Our third speaker and final speaker is, before we open up to the wisdom of the Lanarkshire denizens, is Jim Sillars. Jim was a former Labour MP, of course, and former Deputy Leader of the SNP and author of a book I'll no doubt allude to, In Place of Fear 2. I just want to say one thing to Jim before he gets here. Jim, you don't need stilts to be head and shoulders above some political nyaffs.
Well, I'm really surprised that anybody's here tonight, because according to Joanne Lamont, the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland, and I quote her from the STV debate with Nicola Sturgeon on the 25th of February, we are not genetically programmed to make political decisions in Scotland. Put politely, that means we're all thick. It also means that in Joanne's view, we are a unique nation because nobody else has got DNA that makes them programmed not to make political decisions. Quite a unique position for the leader of the Labour Party. Mind you, I'm not surprised, because the other great statement Joanne made was to describe what we are doing with prescription charges, free bus passes for the elderly and everything as the something-for-nothing society. Now, I was interested in what Kat said, that our old man got somewhat excited when Blair was elected in 1997. When I was 8 years old, I remember my father and Mrs. Logan, a miner's wife, dancing up and down the path between our houses because Labour had won in 1945. And 8 years old, that's all I was. I knew something significant had happened in our lives. And of course, it did happen in our lives. Nobody needed to worry about paying for the doctor any longer. And the men who worked in the railway didn't work for private enterprise any longer, and it was the same with the miners. Now, I didn't stand up with glee in 1997 because I had served with Tony Blair in the House of Commons, and if ever there was a lightweight but a brilliant actor, it was him. What I want to do tonight is put our referendum campaign in its historical context. It's very important we do so. Because, Kat, the United Kingdom or the British state is not rich. It is at the end of the English/British Empire, the final stages of decline. All empires face the same. They rise and they fall. Whether it's the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great, the Romans, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, and the English/British Empire, all will go the same way. Have you ever wondered why, on her Jubilee, the Queen sailed up the Thames in a wee boat, with the Duke of Edinburgh dressed as an admiral of the fleet? The reason is that in every other Jubilee, the monarch has reviewed the fleet. But so skint is the British state, there's no fleet to review any longer. They're building an aircraft carrier that they can't put aircraft on. Now, I'm ex-Royal Navy, so I know a thing or two about this. When you put a carrier group to sea, you've got an aircraft carrier surrounded by frigates and destroyers. Some of them are anti-submarine, and some of them anti-aircraft, all to protect the aircraft carrier. But if you don't have aeroplanes on the aircraft carrier, it's in trouble, and I'll tell you why. Because the anti-aircraft destroyers and frigates only have a certain size of their mast, and the radar up there can't see beyond the horizon. And the missiles that come towards the aircraft carrier come from beyond the horizon. If you have aircraft flying at 20, 30,000 feet, their radar can see beyond the horizon. But if you don't have any aircraft on the aircraft carrier, then you know what happens. That's all an indication of the decline. When I joined the Royal Navy, we had a home fleet, Mediterranean fleet, Far East fleet, and a West Indies station. Now they'll be hard pushed to crew one aircraft carrier. This year, the government again will borrow over £100 billion. The UK national debt by round about 2016-17 will be £1.55 trillion. The debt interest they'll be required to pay for that will be more than they'll pay for defence and education put together. It'll be around about 75 to 78 billion pounds. That's what you're talking about in a country that's in decline. We will decline along with them. And when they tell us this is the best of both worlds, being in the UK with more power for our devolved parliament and those broad shoulders of the United Kingdom, what they're offering at the best is 40% control of the budget at Holyrood, which also means 60% is controlled elsewhere. And there ain't, as I've explained, no broad shoulders. There's just massive, massive debt. We are lucky. We are a nation, and we can escape from that. And this is the opportunity we have on the 18th of September. But Kat and Robin are right. What happens on the 19th of September and every day thereafter is what matters most. It is what we do with our country. Now, my wife calls me a grumpy grandpa. I don't think that's justified. And if she's watching in that web thing there, let me tell her it's definitely not justified. But I am an angry grandpa. I come out of retirement for this campaign because I've got 10 grandchildren. And I've had to tell each of them. I always write to my grandchildren individually when they're leaving primary 7. I write a letter to them, giving them advice. And I've had to tell each of them, if Scotland votes no on the 18th of September, they must get the best qualifications they can in order to get out of our country, because that's the only way they'll have a decent standard of living and prosperity for them and their children and their grandchildren. Because this will remain a low-wage economy for all time coming, with high unemployment, high poverty, and dreadful inequality. I don't want to be able to tell my grandchildren that. I want to be able to tell them and everybody else's grandchildren, this is a country in which you can invest your skill and your talent and your time and your energy and build a community we can all be proud of, and one that's prosperous. And how we do it was with a different economic model to the one that's failed the British state. We need to do, as Robin was saying, look at the resources of our country. And if you take the resources and you build wealth upon that, you're doing something that's there permanently. The greatest resource we have is in our people and in our children. And so the first priority must be what we do with education. And we don't have, although Mike Russell keeps saying it, it's not true, Mike. We don't have the finest world-class system in education. How can it possibly be when we've got 250,000 children in poverty? How can they possibly have a decent start and opportunity in education? In 1973, in the House of Commons Scottish Grand Committee, we discussed a document called Children Born to Fail. 250,000 Waynes in poverty now are born to fail in 2014. We've got to attack that and turn it around. And we can do so without spending a single pound extra. We've got 32 education authorities, 32 bureaucracies, directors of education in a country of 5 million people. Cut it down to 5 education authorities, and you transfer something like, out of the present budget, £500 million into the schools where it is in fact required. But we can do more. Is everybody in here aware that the independent stroke private schools in Scotland get an 80% reduction in their council tax? Because under the Charities Act, they do some public good. If Fettes in Edinburgh, where Tony Blair was educated privately, has a council tax liability of £209,000, but it only pays £41,000. At the other side of our capital city, in a deprived area called Westerhales, the Westerhales School doesn't get the discount. It pays £261,000 in council tax. Now, if we have the audacity that an Iron Bevan instructed us to have, that means that you must think the way the establishment tells you not to think. And you must be able to do what the establishment tells you you can't do. Well, I looked up the Charities Act, and the only reason Westerhales and all the state schools in Scotland don't get that reduction is that they're paid by the minister. Well, with one sweep of the legislative pen, you can remove that inhibition, and all our schools get the same. So without spending one single penny more, we can improve the education in our country and make it world class for the first time for a long time. We're all, I would imagine all, working class in here. Now, I live in middle class Edinburgh. I've got a middle class pension, let me confess. But I'm working class. Always have been, always will be. And there's a lesson the working class has learned, but to some extent has started to ignore. Whether or not we lead a good life depends entirely upon whether we can sell our labour. If we cannot sell our labour, we're in a fix, and we're subject to the state. We have to ask for benefits. And today, of course, if you miss an appointment at the job centre, you're sanctioned, benefits are withdrawn, and you can become destitute. The key issue for the working class is whether or not we can create an economy into which we can sell our labour. And what determines that is the policy of full employment. I heard on the television today them talking about 5% unemployment, something to be joyous about. That means thousands and thousands of Scottish citizens with no jobs and no hope whatsoever. So the first thing we have to do when we become independent, when we've got the power to do so, is raise the flag that was raised in 1945, the flag of full employment. The Attlee government had no embarrassment about arguing for full employment because that generation knew that fundamental principle. You can sell your labour or you can't sell your labour, and that determines whether or not you have a decent way of life. How do we do that? We start by creating jobs, looking at the resources and looking at the need in our society. We've 157,000 families on the housing waiting list. There's only one way to solve that: build houses. If you don't build houses, they remain in the waiting list. And if you build houses, 25,000, 30,000 a year, somebody's got to quarry the sand, somebody's got to make the cement, somebody's got to make the bricks, somebody's got to transport them to the site, and journeymen and apprentices have got to put them together, and plumbers and slaters and joiners have got to create houses. And you've created work right along that chain. How do we pay for it? Well, one of the ways is to look at one of the gifts that John Major and Gordon Brown left to this society, called the Private Finance Initiative. They're going to take something like 22 billion out of our pockets in the decades ahead. What I argue, and I've argued it in the book, is we bring them in and we tell them we want to renegotiate all these PFI contracts. By the way, there is absolutely nothing radical in renegotiating a commercial contract. It's done every day in the week in commerce. If one partner in a contract finds themselves in a different position when the contract was established, then they seek renegotiation. Now these folk will come in and say, no, we don't want to. And it's quite simple. You say, well, there's no problem. We will now pay you 1 year in arrears, and we'll use that money to build houses. But by the way, we're going to tax you at 30% on the PFI contract, so whether you like it or no. Now, you can do that if you've got the power. Nothing stops you if you've got the power. And the only thing that will stop us having the power to do that kind of thing is if we vote no on the 18th of September. Then there's the small, it's already been mentioned, Robin, the number of small, medium-sized enterprises we've got. We've got almost 340,000 small, medium-sized companies in Scotland who get a very bad deal from the banks. We can set up a special bank for them. In fact, it would have been far better doing that than trying to bail out Fred the Shed and RBS. But we can set up a small, medium-sized enterprise bank. One of the cafes I go to, go for a coffee with one of my grandsons. And that lady would like a limited amount of money to expand. Maybe, say, 25,000 pounds. She can't get it. No, there's no bonus in that for the banks. No one. I said to her, phone them up and ask for 20 million. You'll get an interview. You'll not get the 20 million, of course. But that's the kind of bank we need for those small, medium-sized companies. Just think about it. If half of them employed one person more at a decent wage, we're a long way towards creating that full employment. Then there's the other resource that we're not supposed to talk about, and that's oil. I am quite convinced that Better Together goes down on its collective knees night after night after night and prays to God that a hole will open up in the North Sea and the oil will gush away. That would really solve the problem of the debate over oil. We have been, as a Scottish nation, in a prison of lies over the oil. I remember Janie Buchan, who was a Labour MEP, great luminary in the Labour Party, on television, saying it can't be Scotland's oil because we didn't put it there. Harry Selby, who was Margot's opponent, said exactly the same thing, only he called it tartan oil. Now, when I tell my friends in the Arab world that, they fall about laughing. And they say, we didn't put it there either, but by God. One of the strange things about oil in the Scottish nation is that we don't know anything about it. We know about shipbuilding, we know about steel making, we know about coal mining, but our knowledge as a nation of the North Sea oil industry is almost zilch. All the arguments have been how much tax revenue we get. Well, there's a blog written by a chap called Stuart Darling, nothing to do with Alistair. And it's worth reading part of this blog. The debate around oil and gas is one of the most peculiar aspects of Scottish life. The UK political parties and media have made sure the Scottish psyche is such that oil and gas might tick along for a while, but the tide won't flow much longer. And thinking anything else is a high-risk strategy. It's going to run out, so don't think about anything else. Inexplicably, the oil and gas sector was not mentioned once as a possible career at any point during my high school education or during my 4 years studying maths and physics at Glasgow University. As the story goes for thousands of Scots, particularly in the Central Belt, home to one of the world's most technologically advanced industries, and yet oblivious to the potential opportunities that this brings directly to them. And he says, last November, I was in the US, and there was an advert on TV about how the oil and gas sector was helping the economic recovery with an overview of the thousands of new jobs being created. Such high-profile promotion of the sector is almost unthinkable in the UK. For some reason, the positive impact of the industry is kept on a need-to-know basis. And that means the Scots need not to know. The other night in Edinburgh at a meeting, somebody to the left of me, to be fair to him, said, you want a Scottish National Oil Corporation. I want to nationalise the whole of the North Sea. I told him we don't have the human capacity to do that. And he said to me, you're right. There are thousands of workers in the North Sea. They'll ken what to do. But of course they don't. Because they go onto a rig, and there's 570 rigs in the North Sea. They go onto a rig, they don't meet other folk in the other rigs, and when they land at Aberdeen, they disperse home. When we had a steel industry in Motherwell, we had the clubs and the pubs and a lot of people together who would talk about their industry and therefore knew it, the same way mining and shipbuilding. We don't have that in the oil industry. When Thatcher destroyed the British National Oil Corporation, she did so for two reasons. One was she didn't like anything public. The other was that was a window for the nation into what was happening in the North Sea. That window closed, and we don't know a great deal about it. Just think of this. We are 5 million people. Oil for 5 million people at 1.4 million barrels a day is more valuable than it is for 60 million people. We can do more with that oil. And I'm thinking not just of the revenues. I want a Scottish National Oil Corporation. As Robin says, we can borrow to buy oil fields in the North Sea. We can demand a share for the Scottish nation for every project. In Denmark, when they issue a licence, they want 20% in the project for the Danish nation. I'm much, much, much more moderate than that. I said 15. But the important thing is, we would have not just a share of the tax revenues, but of the wealth from the oil itself. And think what we can do with the black stuff. Let's just take a small portion of the oil as it passes through the refinery at Grangemouth and use it to lower the cost of petrol, diesel, and aircraft jet fuel. Think of what that would do. That's a resource. It puts more money in the hands of families to spend in the locality. It makes our transport industry the most competitive in Europe. And it makes our tourist industry one of the best going, because a lot of our tourism comes from the north of England. Man, wife, 2 Waynes in a family car. They hardly go north of the Glasgow-Edinburgh line because of the cost of fuel as you go up into the Highlands. Think what that policy can do to the Scottish tourist industry and the creation of more wealth and more jobs. That's the kind of thing we can do when we're on our own, making our own policies. There's not a snowball's chance in hell of anything like that happening if we remain part of the United Kingdom. Then I just want to say a word on equality. I want, when we are independent in the public sector, everybody working in it and everybody supplying it to get the living wage. And I want, during a 5-year transition period, for the living wage to become mandatory in the private sector as well. But I want to go further than that. I want to see a society in which the person at the top in the public sector gets no more than 13 times what the person at the bottom in the public sector gets. And somebody said to me at a meeting, well, are they top folk? They'll go. I said, well, let them. And then I said, where are they going to go? There are plenty of us to fill the jobs if necessary. I am sick and tired of reading someone at the top in the public sector getting a bonus for doing the highly paid job they're supposed to do in the very first place, and the 13-to-1 ratio will bring that to an end. Can I finish by saying this? The reason that I came out of retirement and took part in this campaign is that I see the opportunity for the Scottish working class to finally find its way ahead under its own steam. We are a very talented people, and yet somehow or other we buy the idea that we are inadequate. We are talented people. I want to energise the Scottish working class, to make them understand the latent power that they've had for years and turn that latent power into real power when we are an independent country. There's an old miner in Nether Third, away back in Cumnock in 1979, who stood up at a meeting I was at, and he said the greatest problem facing the Scottish working class is that all our socialist dreams have been destroyed by the London connection. Well, we can cut that connection, and the Scottish working class can stop dreaming, and we can start turning it into a reality. We can create a better country for our children and our grandchildren. The referendum on the 18th September can be summed up in a short phrase. It is about power. Whether we exercise power or whether power is exercised over us. Between 7 o'clock in the morning and 10 p.m. on the 18th of September, you and me and everybody with a vote in our country is sovereign. We as a nation have sovereign power in our hands. For the first time ever, at 1 minute past 10, have we kept it or have we given it away? And if we've kept it, there'll be no more dreaming. There'll be reality of a better way of life for all of our people.